Welcome to this Airwalk Reply podcast, The Big Questions in Tech, with your host, Alex Hammond, Senior Manager, Abby Waring, and Head of Architecture, Rob Ellison. Together, they answer the big questions on AI.
Welcome, guys.
Hi.
Hi.
We're probably going to get a lot of rolling eyes and eyebrows from tackling AI as our first podcast, but because I think it's fair to say it's kind of everywhere at the moment. But it kind of remiss of us not to tackle it. Our job as kind of consultants in this space is kind of help clients kind of navigate the most complex areas of technology. And I think it's fair to say that whether it's quite hit or not yet, AI represents that. I think probably worth starting with breaking down what AI is, because I think probably the broader public have a view, but I think it's probably not as accurate as it might be. So probably just give us the technologist's whistle-stop tour of what AI is, I guess.
Yeah, so AI has been it's been around for a very long time, maybe since the 70s. Lots of different types of AI, from very specific use cases like computer vision, recognizing objects, kind of predictive text, which we've had since mobile phones pretty much existed. But I think people are quite interested now in more general AI, so things that can generate large amounts of data, images, videos, text, and that's really kind of taken off in the last couple of years, and that's like the interest now.
Has that been driven by a technology kind of advancement? I guess cloud computing has probably got a big role to play in that. Is that what's kind of?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, cloud computing, GPUs, like the power of GPUs is kind of moved that on hugely. Cloud computing and the availability of that resource to anyone to kind of build those things, and on demand as well. Massive step change there.
And then in terms of obviously generative AI is the area that's really kind of coming to the fore with ChatGPT and a number of other areas. What's different about that, I guess, and what's the step forward with generative AI?
I think it's in people's minds more now because it's been on the news like the last couple of years. ChatGPT, OpenAI, people are seeing it on the news, are kind of playing with it themselves. There's all sorts of other things like Stable Diffusion, other systems that people can get access to and start playing with AI or generative AI themselves. And that's why I'm pretty sure that's why it's exploded in everyone's minds.
Yeah, that's fair, isn't it? So public access to these things it's a low barrier, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess like the breadth of people who are kind of exploring it and trying different things, and people are demonstrating to the world, I suppose, all the things that are actually possible. It's not just like a few scientists, I suppose, doing it now. It's the public as well.
We're going to touch on kind of, I guess, some of the exciting things we're seeing, some of the interesting use cases. But before we do you think that we're in a hype curve? I think it's fair to say with AI at the moment. Where do you think we are with that? It feels like there's an awful lot of hype for probably not a huge amount of benefit yet, and lots of generating images of dogs with hats and those sorts of things, and maybe searching your emails for the first time accurately. Is that where we are, or actually are we seeing more kind of potent use cases yet?
I think there's a bit of both. Personally, there's some of it that's definitely hype, and companies kind of jumping on the bandwagon trying to sell AI and everything. There's a lot of hype there, but I think it's genuinely transformational technology. I think it's going to make a change in the world. Maybe as big as the internet. Maybe not quite that big because you wouldn't see it so much, maybe. But yeah, it's going to be huge. I think some of the previous big things like metaverse, it was fairly clear when those popped up that it was interesting, but not really something totally transformative. Whereas with generative AI in particular, I'm pretty confident it is.
Organisations, I think, are starting to obviously see the potential with innovation. We all know there's kind of like a huge scope for innovative products, but the cost efficiencies and the time efficiencies that this can drive is unparalleled. So it can't be ignored. That
probably brings us on to the next question then, really, which what are the things that you're seeing that are kind of particularly interesting or exciting, whether that's right now potential or whether that's kind of thinking about, I guess, advancements in these technologies happen pretty rapidly. So looking at kind of forward to next year and the subsequent years, what are we seeing?
I think right now the big value is around automating administrative tasks. The kind of low hanging fruit, whether it's checking code or generating text, summarizing text. That's like a really great use case. Relatively straightforward to implement. Further field than that, self-driving cars. That's going to be advanced by this. Things like in the medical side of things, personalised medicine. There's so much more that can be done, but maybe a bit more development required to get to that point. Whereas the kind of more general administrative things, that's here now, and people can start leveraging that right now.
With the, I guess, developer copilot, for want of a bit of descriptor, how close are we to that being really compelling?
Yeah, I think they're more kind of assistive technologies, which is how we're describing it to customers. It's not replacing developers, but it's getting rid of the boring work. So, no one likes writing tests. It's quite good at writing tests. Everyone hates documentation. It's pretty good at writing documentation. But when it comes to code, you've kind of got to have the context of everything that you're doing and why you're doing it and your standards and everything, and it's not quite there yet. Whether it can get there or not, I'm not sure. I use GitHub Copilot sometimes when I'm trying to write code, and it's quite good. It's useful, but then you find yourself kind of dumbing down a bit. So you can rely on Copilot, and then you're not doing it yourself. You're kind of letting it do it for you and not really checking it.
Do you think that's a danger? So we fast forward 5 years down the line, and actually the next generation of development communities just aren't going to have that context, are they?
Yeah, I think so.
So what's the model is the model to pursue it? As you say, it's an assistive technology. It's augmenting teams and capabilities. It's maybe allowing a smaller number of team members to do the same amount. Is that's
making them more efficient, making the quality higher.
It's not necessarily about reducing the size of your teams. I don't think it's about really freeing those people up to focus on creativity and innovation rather than, as you say, the day-to-day administration and tasks that can easily be automated that probably people don't enjoy doing very much anyway. But also there's a big buzz around the 4-day week, and this is really something that could enable and facilitate that. There's no reason for everybody to have to do this 5-day week necessarily. And those efficiencies could help enable that.
I guess without diving down the rabbit hole, the flip side of that is that if you're removing low-skilled tasks and automating them, the elephant in the room, I think, for a lot of organisations is what does that mean for low-skilled workers, I guess. Yeah.
I think it depends, doesn't it? Because some dev teams, you'll find that those, more rudimentary tasks just don't get done. They get passed over. So, look at any code base in any organisation. Is it well documented? Is it well tested? 9 times out of 10, probably not. Whereas this can bring that extra without a huge amount of extra effort.
What we see a lot is that it's incredibly difficult to recruit high quality people in this space, isn't it? So is it potentially the way to think about it is rather than having to hire 5 or 6 people with that skill set, you can potentially look at hiring 2 or 3 people that covers a similar amount of work because you're having to remove all of that.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Because at the moment, we a lot of our clients, including ourselves, it's always been a difficult market to hire good people in that space, isn't it? So I'm wondering if that's actually what we're going to see is
people doing what they're good at.
Yeah, people being able to focus on doing what they're good at, which is probably going to make it easier for, like, we work with a lot of banks, for example, don't we? So their ability to hire and compete in the market against the likes of Google, Facebook, etc. Well, if they're doing the more interesting end of things when it comes to engineering and development, maybe that kind of makes it not less of the administrative.
A bit of a sale for those people as well.
Yeah,
all your tests are automated, all your documentation is automated. You're going to be a coder, pure coder.
Yeah.
I think most people have a large portion of their job that is probably tasks they don't enjoy doing that could be taken away by or alleviated by this technology. If
we touch on so a couple of the sectors that we work with are quite a lot, right? So financial services and public sector, so complex, quite heavily regulated industries, security, compliance, those sorts of things. What are your thoughts in terms of what AI means in that space?
Again, huge benefits, similar benefits, but I think they're going to have to be a bit more careful about how they do things. So we've seen examples, fairly regularly, maybe weekly, of companies who aren't regulated. The kind of media industry or whatever it might be, where they've implemented some sort of generative AI and it's gone a bit wrong because they haven't put the guardrails around it. They haven't thought about it. They haven't kind of looked into exactly what it's doing and how to make it behave well or catch when it doesn't behave well. And there's examples like car companies, for example, that have released a chatbot and it's the people on the internet just taking over and just taking the piss out of it, basically. Embarrassing for the companies. Finance industry isn't really going to be able to let that happen.
No.
So there's going to have to be quite a lot of upfront thinking. How do we kind of capture those things? How do we monitor generative AI? How do we kind of prevent bad things from happening where we can? And how do we retrospectively monitor it for anything that's, suboptimal?
So that unintended segue probably brings us on to the next element, really, which is I think what we're seeing a lot, and what we're getting a lot of traction in the market, is that there are a lot of companies that are claiming to be able to implement AI for clients, but that's probably not the hard bit, ironically, and keep me honest on this, Robert, in terms of the technology itself versus maybe a cloud adoption, which required quite a step change in terms of the underlying infrastructure, the ways of working, all that sort of stuff. If that's in place, implementing AI from a technology perspective is probably relatively straightforward in some instances. But the change to the organization, the change to the processes, the potential kind of compliance security challenges, there's a whole host of things that certainly our view is that actually that's where it gets complex for those sorts of organizations, financial services, public sector, regulated industries, certainly any industries that have got kind of confidential data, that sort of thing. I guess, let's talk through that. So in terms of the challenges that we're seeing and the things that we're probably seeing a lack of maturity around, what are those kind of big ticket items?
So just to touch on the regulatory side, the UK, in contrast to the EU, is taking an innovation-led approach to AI regulation. So at the moment, there's no legislation around this. It's building upon the existing digital regulation that we have. And there's a framework of principles, and regulators have been asked to come up with their AI annual strategies that will lay out guidance for specific sectors. So it's taking an approach that is waiting and seeing what the impact of these technologies are, and legislation will come inevitably further down the line. So there's going to be a lot for organisations to keep abreast of. The industries that we're talking about there really need to invest in compliance. Resources need to be focused on this and constantly paying attention to what's going on and how their use cases and development align with that. I think a robust governance is going to be really key. So obviously there's organisations operating in regulated sectors will have governance processes around everything that they do within the technology space, but adapting those to focus on the incoming regulation, having an ethical component is really important. So cross functional teams involving HR perhaps in your compliance with this stuff. I think governance is key.
How do you stop it from being a blocker, I guess? So what we see in the innovation space in banking in particular, and to an extent public sector as well, is that it only goes so far, and ultimately the risk aversion kind of kicks in, and it kind of blocks it, or certainly slows it down dramatically. Do we think that's going to be the case, or do we think that actually there are things that they can be doing to mitigate that?
Yeah, I think they need to get ahead of it. So there's lots of people, like you say, experimenting, trying different things, which is great. But at some point, they're going to have to get those workloads into production, and doing them as maybe thousands of individual use cases is probably a bad idea. It needs to be a kind of centralized function. Look at the different patterns, look at the different common use cases, and build those profiles, build the risk profile, work out how you're going to monitor it, how you're going to control it, how you're going to prove to a regulator when it appears, how that you're doing things the right way.
Yeah.
The first thing that a lot of larger organisations need to do, and probably smaller organisations as well, is really get a handle on what is being done at the moment. I think most organisations aren't really aware of what's going on. There's got a lot of development teams that are kind of innovating in their spaces. So getting a handle on that, bringing it all together, consolidating, looking at how the risk and business benefits of each use case, how repeatable and scalable that is. And as I say, applying an ethical lens to it, a compliance lens, and looking at the business case for each use case, and as you say, enabling through standard patterns and development.
I think the business case thing is interesting, isn't it? I think yet again what we're seeing quite prevalent in these organisations is a lack of maturity around actually building a robust business case that actually delivers some level of strategic value. It's very bottom up. It's very reactive to what the tools can do right now, rather than thinking maybe 6 to 12 months ahead and saying, right, okay, what's the art of the possible? What would actually move the needle in terms of our organisation, our operations, our sales, our customer engagement. It's very much tech-led, I think, isn't it? And we're starting to see that change a little bit, but it was the same with cloud, albeit cloud was probably a bit less business-driven. But yeah, we're seeing a bit of a trend, aren't we, that technology functions need to build their maturity and thinking in terms of how strategic can this be? I mean, how do you tackle that, I suppose? How do you help a development lead suddenly understand the impact from a business perspective?
I think it's a similar problem to cloud, 5-10 years ago, where it was being sold as a kind of business transformation tool, and that's what it was. The companies that took it from that perspective and thought, right, how can we use cloud to transform our business? They're the ones who are incredibly successful, like Netflix, Uber. Those kind of companies that built their company from ground up, thinking what their business is, and then aligning the technology to the to the business. It's going to be exactly the same with generative AI in particular. If they tackle it from what are the business problems that we've got, and then worry about how to solve it. It might not be AI; it's the problem. It might be might not be the solution. There might be other things. It's exactly the same for me. It's just another tool in the toolbox.
It's very true, isn't it? We've had a number of conversations, haven't we, with clients, and the start of the conversation has been, I want to look at what's the art of the possible for AI in my business, and what it ends up pivoting to quite quickly is, how do I leverage technology to become a more efficient organisation? And that might be AI, but more likely it's using the tools you've got better. It's moving to more of an automation model. It's probably looking at the skills you've got. It's the kind of fundamentals. If you get those right, then you can start maybe looking at some of the more advanced technologies. But it's probably getting the table stakes right first, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that. Measuring all the use cases. Seeing if they're genuinely going to be transformative.
Yeah.
Prioritize them in order of how much value they're going to bring to the organisation, rather than just picking off things that someone thinks might be a cool thing to do. There's plenty of cool things to do, and you can implement them fairly quickly. But that's kind of that's taking focus away from people who could be making real business change and developing real value.
And it's funny, isn't it? I think AI, because of the public access to it and some of the kind of more creative things, I guess, that it can do, I think the perception is that the real business case and strategic value is in those use cases, in the kind of the real kind of front end customer facing things. Whereas actually what we've seen so far is that probably the really big ticket things are in the background. But how do you drive operational efficiencies? How can you do more with less? If we think about public sector, the whole thing is about how do you do more with less, or more with the same money, people, capacity. And so that's where I think the really interesting use cases that are emerging in the business case is about doing that, rather than, I keep coming back to it, dogs with hats pictures, but that kind of more creative lens, which is it's absolutely going to transform the creative industries. But the industries we work in, it's less about that. It's how do you get services right consistently that are scalable for as little money as possible. And so if you can drive operational efficiencies through automation, which is fundamentally what I think a lot of the AI can bring, and being more data-led and making better decisions, then that could take billions out of those budgets, couldn't it?
Rob mentioned low-hanging fruit earlier, and I think, and as you say, looking at operational efficiencies internally, it's a great place to start as well. It's internal, low-risk use cases, much lower risk than anything customer-facing. So it's the best place for most organisations to start focusing, for sure, for all those reasons and more.
Or kind of starting off with things that are human in the loop. So the AI generates something, and you've got a human saying, "Yeah, I'm happy with that. Let's send it." So it's saving the time to generate that text, which might be it might be a long legal letter. Maybe that's a bad example. A long letter to a customer might take them an hour to write it themselves. If generative AI can do it, exactly, yeah.
What's interesting about the human in the loop is that I've had a couple of conversations with. If you take healthcare, for example, doctors know best. Certainly, they believe they do. So, I had a conversation with a health insurer, and they were starting to use AI to analyze kind of cancer diagnostics and images and things like that. They had a human in the loop, and the human in the loop was reversing the decisions. And when they looked back to analyze them, the doctor was wrong pretty much every time they changed the decision. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's seen as a risk management approach, but actually, there's going to be cases where kind of needs to be thought about in a different way. I think.
There's probably a bit of subconscious bias there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not having this system taking over my job. It's definitely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we're not at the point where AI is going to maybe remove a tumour, I guess. But so I think the human in the loop there is probably where that needs to sit. But yeah, it is interesting. I think there's a whole host of things that we probably haven't even thought of yet, aren't there, in some of these industries that are going to have to be tackled. I mean, we haven't really touched on the ethical side of things, so maybe it's worth touching on that. I mean, what are your thoughts on that notion that actually particular companies can reduce headcount by hundreds of people? There was, I think it was Klarna recently, where they've taken something like the equivalent of 700 people out of their customer operations. I guess there's a question, and this is maybe a naive thing to say, but because we're in a capitalist society, rightly or wrongly, but there's a can we and should we question, I suppose, isn't there? Like the 4-day week is predicated on everybody willing to go to the 4-day week. The people that want to stay on the 5-day week will see that as a competitive advantage. Then you're back in the same loop, aren't you? So, I guess what are your thoughts on that? Is that something that it's not something we're really hearing from clients yet? I don't think, but maybe that's the nature of the clients we work with. But it's going to come, isn't it?
They're definitely worried about it. You can tell, and that's part of what we're putting in place in the the AI enablement. It's the people side of things is just important. Like Abby said earlier on, the HR needs to be really involved in some of these initiatives. But I guess the problem is if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. You've lost your advantage.
The balance,
You'll be out of business fairly soon.
You mentioned that people who want to do a 5-day week might see that as a competitive advantage, but actually it's going to be for organisations to bring in the best talent. So if an organisation can switch to a 4-day week and pay the similar salaries, people are going to be attracted to that inevitably. So it would certainly help with finding the best people.
Yeah, I always feel like it's going to be a balance though, isn't it? But yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be a really interesting space. I mean, financial services, so if we take contact centres, for example, the ability to take significant amounts of the kind of more administrative and basic kind of response tasks. We've seen some of our colleagues implementing that elsewhere. That it can be transformational in an organisation where you're budget constrained and you've got limited resources. That's massive because it means you can cope with scale. But the alternative is also true. If you've already got scale of people and you take a huge amount of that has got implications that probably aren't. We've not seen it yet. I don't think we've not seen any kind of major AI-driven Well, I think we're seeing some preemptive ones, aren't we? There's certain big organisations out there that are making preemptive cuts, but I think it's going to be coming thick and fast, isn't it, in the coming years? This is definitely a consideration.
Yeah, I think the communications platform use case is really interesting, actually, because if you think about when you're contacting a company today, whether it's a chatbot on their website or ringing them up and pressing 1, 2, 3, listening to a annoying voice thing.
Yeah.
It's a lot of it is about improving the customer experience at that point. There's no people involved there.
Yeah.
The chatbot can be, have more information, be a bit more intelligent. The IVR system isn't relying on you listening to 10 minutes of do you want to press this or press that? It's a bit more, a bit more natural.
Yeah.
We were looking the other day at some marketing for this sort of thing, and there's some stats out there like 90% of people say that their contact with a company is what decides whether they stick with that company or not. So improving that kind of first contact or repeat contact with customers is hugely important. It's nothing to do with replacing people. It's about improving that system that's already a machine system.
But that's a principle, isn't it, that an organisation can take? And you're probably more likely to see that in the public sector, where they take the principle, which is how do we use AI to create a better citizen experience and a better outcome?
Yeah.
Is that, if we look at the private sector, I guess the question is, that should be the principle, which is how do we use technology to give our customers a better experience and better outcome? But there's also a question as to, okay, how do we use it to take a bunch of costs out of our business and maybe deliver the same outcome? And that would be a shame, I think, wouldn't it, if that's the case? But
yeah, I guess they can take a cost out of a particular bit of the business and reinvest it elsewhere.
Yeah. That
would be the optimal, wouldn't it?
It's inevitable that the way we work and the types of jobs that exist will change in the coming years, and that that's been happening for forever.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing happened with when computers were.
Or the industrial revolution before that.
Well, exactly,
machines are improving. It's just the same again, isn't it? Really.
Yeah. So people need to keep an eye on how things are changing and try and upskill as technology moves. But there are going to be changes.
Just wonder if you're a company these days that sort of stick to their guns and making metal in an old school forge with people, banging things out. It's just not sustainable, is it?
It'll become artisanal and they'll sell it for a 300% markup. Probably.
Well, maybe.
But yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it's interesting. I think the skills that are going to become more and more important, it's kind of almost come full circle, I think, hasn't it? It used to be about people and relationship building and that kind of emotional intelligence and all that sort of stuff. And then I think, technology probably changed that, and it became, just look at the people that are CEOs of the big companies now. I would imagine their EQ is probably not off the scale in some cases. But I think it feels like with AI taking on a lot of those tasks, it probably circles back around again, doesn't it? It's that an ability to be empathetic and have that emotional intelligence are probably going to become kind of top skills again, aren't they, for people? Which is interesting, because I think the next generation is probably a bit more of a challenge for them. But
I think a lot of the ethicality concerns are also around how it's used in terms of discrimination and how it can have a bias and be used. So one of the use cases that the EU has banned is biometric identification in law enforcement. So anything that can introduce that bias, and obviously organisations have to be cognizant of that.
It's an interesting topic, that as well, isn't it? Because you need to measure for that, and if you measure for that, it's going to introduce some sort of delay. We were talking the other day about the kind of concept of AI being like giving a task to a person. Would you give a task to someone and let them immediately release it to the customer? Depends what it is.
Yeah.
If it's something quite important or quite, they might be telling them something that's not quite right, you'd probably put a check in, like another person or a process or something. And we have to do exactly the same with AI, which introduces delay. So some of those use cases where it's a kind of a natural interactive chat might not be appropriate, where the response might be, car manufacturers that are out there, they've introduced chatbots, and those chatbots aren't well controlled, so the response is quite fast. So the user experience is quite good, but they haven't got any controls in place so that when that chatbot is given a prompt or an input to a conversation, there's nothing checking what's sent back. So there's examples where people have persuaded the chatbot to sell them a car for £1,
right,
and I'm not sure how it's ended up actually, but there's potential that is legally binding. So they might have had to have sold a car for £1. Maybe that happened or didn't happen, but there's going to be similar problems in the future.
It kind of comes back to how do you tackle some of those challenges, doesn't it? So I think what we're suggesting for clients is to think about the use cases in those terms, isn't it? So the lower risk use cases, stay a long way from your customers for now, because we just don't know how the technologies are going to respond and evolve, how best to do the kind of tracking and compliance and testing and all that, and the ongoing monitoring. I think it's fair to say that's still quite an immature space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas your internal use cases, like things like your internal service desk, it's customer facing, but worst case scenario, your internal service desk tells your internal users something incorrect or inflammatory. You can manage that, or ideally you kind of really focus on those automation of tasks and kind of those operational
human in the loop.
Yeah, and maintain human in the loop. But it's a risk approach, isn't it? So it's having a risk management approach and structure. And again, it was the same for cloud, wasn't it? You didn't start by putting your core banking system on cloud and having at it. Well, I think a couple did, and it didn't end brilliantly.
Go too well.
You started with publicly available data in your website, for example, if you're a bank, because worst case scenario, actually very little of your business is done there, and the data you're losing is publicly available. And then you graduate through as you get more comfortable, as you build more of the security controls. And it's exactly the same thing, isn't it? It's just having a sensible approach.
Yeah, I think it's about building up that catalogue of use cases and the kind of risk ceiling that you're happy with. There's no good really all this innovation happening if 90% of those innovations are going to be shut down because they don't meet the risk profile that the organisation is happy with. So doing that up front is going to be critical. If you're doing a chatbot, for example, it's the use case that everyone jumps onto, then in that organisation, then this is the only data that you're allowed to potentially respond with. This is the only thing that we're going to let you have access to. And we're going to have, X or Y checks before the response is sent.
So that's all we've got time for today. Catch us in part 2 of the big questions in AI. See you next time. Thank you.